The Detroit Lions are down to their final preseason game, which means players have one more opportunity to impress this coaching staff before final cuts are made. So, with that in mind, what players need to stand out the most? Let's talk about it. What's going on, guys? Welcome to the Pride of Detroit YouTube channel. I'm Miko, and in today's video, we are going to take a look at the Lions roster and point out a couple players who need to make the very most out of this last preseason game that the Lions have against the Carolina Panthers. Now, when looking at this list, we're going to try and focus on guys that are probably on the bubble or on the fringe of making this roster and need at least one more good performance to push them over the edge, or one more bad performance that could basically keep them off the roster. So, without further ado, let's get started with this list. The first person on my list, going from the bottom, working my way to the top, is center Brad Cecil. Now, Brad Cecil is a UDFA center that the Lions picked up once they went into this offseason. And once the Lions lost Ross Pierschbacher, it was pretty obvious that there was going to be a need at center. And so far through 2 games, Brad Cecil has done okay, but I don't think he's done nearly enough to guarantee himself a spot on this roster. And that's kind of a really tough situation for him to be in because technically he would be the most likely to play behind Frank, seeing as Graham Glasgow is in a roster battle with Halapoli Vati for that starting right guard position. But it's worth keeping in mind that if Graham doesn't win that position, he almost by default falls into the backup center position role. And this is due to the fact that the Lions have a couple other interior offensive linemen that could potentially play guard, and that wouldn't require Graham to be the first man up to back up Vitae in the event that he suffered an injury. Now, he more than likely would, as long as Frank was healthy and Vitae was the one going down. But if Frank goes down, it almost feels like the Lions would be way more comfortable sliding Graham over to center and moving up one of these other interior offensive linemen. And with that in mind, that's what makes this game very important for Brad Cecil, as he's going to have to be able to show that he can be a viable backup regardless of what the Lions decide to do with the right guard position. And even if they do decide to keep Graham as a backup, Brad needs to establish the fact that he too can be a backup center for Frank Ragnow. The next player on my list is someone that we've talked about a few times on this channel and honestly has been a great story throughout training camp, and that player being defensive tackle Levi ONWUZURIKE. Now, Levi to me has done enough to probably get himself a spot on this roster, but the problem that Levi is going to run into, which is something similar with a couple other players on this list, is the question of how many players do the Lions actually want to carry at defensive tackle. We know that Aleem and Isaiah Buggs will be their starters. They drafted Broderick Martin, so he is very likely to play. And Benito Jones is someone who's had a very good training camp and a very good preseason as well, especially with the fact of especially when you start looking at his stats and the fact that Jones has already put up 2 sacks in the 2 preseason games that he's played. Now, Levi, on the other hand, hasn't been bad. He's actually been graded very well in terms of PFF as a player this offseason. But when you try to start comparing these two players, it really does come down to, okay, do the Lions have a preference? Or the next question being, do the Lions need 5 defensive tackles, especially when you consider the fact that they have the likes of Josh Pascal and John Kaminsky both being players that they occasionally will kick inside to play the 3 type position. Now, at first glance, I'm tempted to say that Levi still has a very strong chance of making this roster simply off the fact that Brad Holmes drafted him high and he's still coming off of that injury. And I think the Lions would love to be able to give Levi that opportunity to showcase his ability that he had when they first drafted him. The problem is, I just don't think it's going to be that easy, and I don't think Benito Jones is going to just roll over and allow Levi to have a better performance than him so that he can make the roster over Jones. So with that said, Levi is going to need to go into this game and maximize the most of his snaps. Him and Benito Jones will likely be lined up next to each other throughout this game, and Levi's going to have to be the more consistent player during those moments. And I believe that if he can put together a good enough performance, he should be able to leapfrog Benito Jones and be that 4th defensive tackle that the Lions decide to keep. Now, again, this could become a moot point if the Lions decide to keep five. And if that case, Levi to me would automatically be in. But if they don't, Levi's really going to need this game to showcase why he should be on the roster over the likes of Benito Jones. Now, number four on this list, and you guys should kind of know this about me at this point in time when it comes to these types of videos, I like to group a bunch of players together just so that I don't have to have a ridiculously long list and possibly have to repeat myself. But at the number four spot, we have all of the wide receivers that are currently battling for that wide receiver five, wide receiver six spot. And this race is very highly contested, in my opinion. I know that there's many of you that believe that there should be one or two guys that are very obvious, but I think there can be an argument made for the top four that I'm about to list off when you look at the likes of Antoine Green, Chase Cota, Dylan Drummond, and Maurice Alexander. I think Trinity Benson has just missed too much time. And then on top of that, he had a really poor performance against the Jacksonville Jaguars. So I have a hard time believing that he would make this roster, other than the simple fact that the Lions did invest a draft pick in him. But to this point, Trinity Benson just hasn't worked out. So for me, he's on the outside of this conversation when it comes to making the roster at wide receiver five or six if the Lions decide to go with six wide receivers. Now, the first person I named off is Antoine Green. And Antoine Green to me is the player that kind of gets left out once we start talking about which wide receiver should make this list. To this point in the preseason, Antoine Green statistically has been the most consistent wide receiver and has done the most with his opportunities. Throughout the preseason, he's been targeted five times and brought in four of those passes for 54 yards, which is the second most receiving yards by any of the wide receivers that have been playing throughout the preseason. Now, of course, he doesn't have a touchdown and he hasn't necessarily had a wow type moment or a wow type play. But when you're talking about this Lions offense and what they're looking from their receivers, you're looking for guys that that can produce and that will be consistent. Antoine Green has been that to this point, and with him being a draft pick that the Lions chose this year, it should be kind of mentioned that he should be one of the guys that has that very strong chance of making this roster. Now, the next person on the list, Chase Cota, is the fan favorite that a lot of people are gravitating towards and saying that he should be the guy to make the team at either wide receiver five or wide receiver six. And when people start talking about that, it's mainly because when you look at the statistics alone, Chase Cota is leading in every category for the wide receivers. He's had the most targets with 10. He's had the most receptions with six. He has the most receiving yards with 69 yards, and he's the only one with a touchdown. And I think there is something to be said for what he might be able to bring to this roster outside of playing the wide receiver position. Now, of course, people are going to start typing in the chat about how he did have that punt return. But the problem with that is that you have Khalif Raymond, and Khalif is your punt returner. Not to mention, you have a number of other players on this roster that could do punt return responsibilities before you even got to Chase Cota. So it really does start to kind of stretch the fact of like, yes, Chase has done a lot and he's put together a performance that is very similar to that of Tom Kennedy. But I wouldn't crown him as the wide receiver that has a for sure shot of making this roster as they go into this last preseason game. Next on the list is Dylan Drummond. And Dylan Drummond has been the training camp darling for everybody. He's performed on the field and shown the type of character that makes you believe that he would fit in perfectly with this Lions culture. The problem with Dylan Drummond, though, is that while he's been fairly impressive in training camp and in practices, he hasn't been nearly as impressive once he gets into the game. To this point, Dylan Drummond's been targeted 9 times and only brought in 4 receptions for 42 yards and has had 2 drops in the preseason so far and no touchdowns as well. So when you start to kind of look at, yes, he is fairly consistent in practice, but what he's doing on the practice field isn't quite translating to the football field once the games start. Now, I'm not saying that's all his fault. Obviously, it's been well documented that the Lions have had their struggles with both the offensive line and the quarterback play. But again, if we're talking about needing this game and needing a strong performance to be able to separate themselves, that's something that Dylan Drummond absolutely needs going into this game against the Carolina Panthers. And last but not least, there's Maurice Alexander. Now, statistically, as a wide receiver, Maurice Alexander has probably been the least impressive wide receiver on this list. However, what he brings to the Lions is a defined role and something that they know that he's very good at. And that being special teams, specifically looking at kick return, and that you know that you would have a very capable backup as a punt returner as well, as he's already taken one punt back for a touchdown in this preseason. It's worth keeping in mind that when we talk about wide receiver 5 and wide receiver 6, these players are basically going to make their bread and butter on special teams. And with Maurice Alexander, you know exactly where you're going to play him in those situations. And so while he may not have the numbers or the physical ability to play the wide receiver spot like that of Chase COTA, Dylan Drummond, or even Antoine Green, the Lions know immediately where they would use Maurice Alexander and what level of play he's going to bring to the field when they put him into that role. So, with that said, it's fairly easy to see why this group is so crowded and why there's going to need to be such stellar performances from one of these guys to be able to separate themselves and to be able to take control of that wide receiver 5 spot and potentially a wide receiver 6 spot if one is available. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about the wide receivers and how they need to separate themselves. The next player on this list needs a strong performance as well, just like everybody else on this list, to at least give himself a chance at making this roster. And that being once again Julian Okwara. Now, Julian has had an offseason to this point that is very much like Dan Campbell described Julian as a player. He's flashed in the first game against the Giants with the 3 sacks and then been very non existent in the Jacksonville game. In fact, when you start looking at Julian's stat line, outside of 3 sacks, he doesn't have too many other impressive stat lines. He doesn't have any solo tackles. He doesn't have any assisted tackles. He does have some pressures, but again, outside of that, outside of what he's brought as rushing the passer, he's not bringing a whole lot. And so when the Lions are looking at this edge group, they currently have 7 edges on the roster, and it's more likely that they keep either 5 or 6 of those guys. Julian is immediately the guy that is on the outside looking in because of the simple fact that I don't know if the Lions are going to believe that they can trust him and depend on him to be the number one thing that Dan Campbell pointed out, which is consistent. Now, Julian can put a lot of that to bed by going into this Carolina game and being a consistent football player, by making the most out of his opportunities and playing both against the pass and against the run. If he's able to do that, I'm not saying that he'll get on the roster, but like I've been saying throughout camp for the most part, he can at least make it a conversation and make it a little bit harder for the Lions to try to move on from him or potentially just trade him outright and try to get some type of compensation. But either way, going into this game with the Panthers, Julian needs a strong performance to at least give himself a shot at staying in Detroit. Now, the number 2 person on my list is a player that I believe also has a really tough and difficult road to try to make this roster, and that is cornerback Chase Lucas. Now, Chase is a player that the Lions drafted last year, and throughout camp and what we saw in Hard Knocks, Chase showed the ability that, like, you know what, maybe he could develop into a really strong corner that could probably carve out a reserve role for this team going forward. And I think that was a lot of fans' expectations as we walked into this offseason. The thing that I don't think Chase nor many of us expected was that a couple UDFAs were also going to come onto the scene and put up really impressive performances. And not just put up impressive performances, but the fact that they're putting up impressive performances at the cornerback position. And Chase is kind of struggling this offseason. If you don't believe me, simply look at Chase's PFF grade. Currently, he is the second lowest rated cornerback that the Lions have played this preseason. The only corner that's been worse than him by a PFF grade standpoint is Colby Richardson, who is also a UDFA. Throughout the 2023 preseason, Chase has been targeted 6 times, he's given up 5 receptions, and he's giving up a passer rating of 100.7, which is the third most by any cornerback on this Lions roster. The only players, again, that are giving up a higher passer rating is Starling Thomas and once again, Colby Richardson. These are 2 UDFAs, and while Starling Thomas has definitely struggled as far as from a coverage standpoint, we also know that he kind of has the tools and the makeup of a player that would gravitate themselves or make themselves appealing to the likes of Aaron Glenn as someone that they would look to develop long term. Not to mention his special teams capabilities if they decided to keep him as a kick returner or simply just as a gunner. So while Chase has his own issues to worry about when it comes to how he performs at the cornerback spot on the football field, he also has to get over that hurdle of showcasing the ability to be versatile and being able to play special teams, which he does and he is willing to do. But then the question becomes, can he do it just as well, if not better, than the likes of Starling Thomas, than Stephen Gilmore? And the list goes on and on and on. The Lions have plenty of corners that they could utilize both in a reserve role and on special teams. And when it comes to that, Chase is going to need to use that game to stand out and show that he is someone that they can rely on to be utilized in special teams or to be a reserve corner that can back up either on the outside or on the inside. Again, I don't think the book is by any means closed on Chase Lucas, but like this list is kind of showcasing, a lot of these players have fit into this category. He just needs a really big game and a good, strong performance to showcase why he should be picked over the likes of some of these other rookie cornerbacks that the Lions have on the roster. And the number one player on this list shouldn't really surprise anybody, but it's Matt Nelson. Matt Nelson has been on this football team for quite some time now. And for the time that he's been here, he's had a dedicated role as far as that third tackle on the Lions roster that can be utilized as a swing tackle as well. The problem with this offseason is when Matt Nelson has been put in position to play either left or right tackle, it hasn't looked the greatest. Now, in his defense, it did look a little bit better when he played right than when he played left. But when the Lions choose to keep a third tackle, it's not like they're technically keeping you to play one specific tackle spot. They could be looking for Matt Nelson to play one of those spots. And if he can't handle possibly playing left, it really starts to limit what your offense would be able to do. Now, the benefit that the Lions would have that most teams don't have is that their starting right tackle in Penei Sewell would be able to flip over to left tackle if something were to happen to Taylor Decker. And then they, yes, could technically utilize Matt Nelson as a right tackle. The question then becomes, though, would you rather have Matt Nelson or Jermaine Ifedi, who, in my opinion, has had the better training camp, has had the better preseason performances, and he's played well at both left and right tackle. So, with Matt Nelson going into this final preseason game, he's currently 1 for 1. He's had a really terrible performance against the New York Giants, and he had a good to decent performance against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I'm going to say good to decent because that entire offensive line did not look good, but he was by far not the worst player on that offensive line against the Jaguars. So that leads him going into this Carolina game. So that means he needs to go into this game against the Carolina Panthers to showcase the Lions coaching staff that he once again can be relied upon and that he is someone that they can invest a roster spot into to be that safety net in the event that one of their starting tackles goes down. So guys, that's going to do it for my list. These are the players that I believe need to go into this Carolina preseason game and really shine and have a good performance in order to help themselves make this roster. And none of these players, in my opinion, can afford a bad performance because I do think a bad performance could leave them off this roster. So with that said, let me know in the comment section below, what do you think of my list? Is there someone that I left off? Is there someone that you personally would have put on this list? And do you have a problem with somebody on my list that you don't think is in danger of not making this roster? Also, if you're looking for more information on the Detroit Lions or just want some additional coverage from what you're currently getting, be sure to head over to prideofdetroit.com where our staff is working on a number of different articles. The offseason may be winding down, but we're not slowing down in terms of content. So definitely head over to the website and check out any of the new stuff that we have going up. Also, if you are new to this channel, if you've never watched a Pride of Detroit video before, please be sure to hit that subscribe button. Also hit that notification bell. That way you can be notified anytime we upload a new video to this channel. Once again, everybody, I'm Miko here at Pride of Detroit. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.